While we're trying to digest that enormous quantity of analysis and data and information, we'll turn to Ronald, who might help us in what he's going to contribute. Thank you, Ronald.
Well, first of all, thanks to the organizers for inviting me, representing the ETUC. Also, thanks to the two colleagues here, Özlem and Thomas, for writing this very interesting paper that is challenging mainstream economics. As we all know, mainstream economics is telling us time and time again that if we want to get out of the crisis, we have to squeeze wages down. Well, their research is actually saying the opposite. At the same time, I have a confession to make. And the confession is that I'm not a trained econometrician. So I will not go into lengthy detail about mathematical formulas and methodological issues. What I simply want to do is to comment from my practical experience as economist working at the ETUC on the two main ideas in this paper. To summarize those two main ideas again, well, here you have it on the slide. The paper actually is saying two things. First of all, it is saying that in a majority of economies in Europe, that wage squeezes do not lead to more growth or more investment. And that is actually an understatement, because what they're actually saying is the opposite. That in many economies, if you squeeze wages down, you will get less investment and less growth. That's the first main idea. The second main idea in their paper is to say that wage policy has a European dimension. So if European member states act together on the front of wages, well, that has an entirely different effect on things than when each member state acts alone and independently from each other. So as said, let me comment from my experience at the ETUC on both ideas. And so let's take this first idea, where you can say that the past couple of years we've had a kind of natural experiment in Europe. The experiment that is called internal wage devaluation, where the big idea of our politicians was to say, well, we can't cut the exchange rate any longer in the euro area, so we have to cut wages instead. And the whole mantra was to say, well, if we cut wages in Spain, in Greece, in Italy, and so on, then exports will improve, those countries will come out of the crisis, jobs will be created, and so on. So after 4 to 5 years of that kind of policy, let's take a look at the results. And what you here see is a graph that combines over the 2009-2013 period the change in wage costs, unit labor costs, and the change in export volumes. And so what you would normally expect to see is a negative relationship. So if wage costs increase, then exports should go down, or the other way around. Well, the trend line you are observing here is not a negative trend line. What you see is a line with a positive slope. It's slightly positive, it's almost flat, but it's positive, and it's certainly not negative. And I can go through the details of some countries for that with you. Take a look at Cyprus, where Cyprus cut wage costs by 5%. Their exports increased by 0. Greece has cut wage costs over that period by 10%. And yes, their export volumes have gone up with also 10%. But Finland, where wage costs went up with 5%, also had an increase in exports of 10%. And you can take other countries as well. Take the example of Germany, for example, where again wage costs went up by 5%, but their exports went much higher up than other countries. So this message of you squeeze wages down, you increase exports, does not hold in practice. Then the other thing is to say, well, if we squeeze wages down, we will create jobs and manage unemployment. So here you would expect to see a positive relationship. You increase wage costs and unemployment goes up, or you decrease wage costs and unemployment goes down. And what you see here in practice is a negative relationship. The trend line is going down, indicating that the more you increase wages, the more you push unemployment down. What explains this are two things. One is on the left-hand side of the graph, where you have all these countries like Spain, Portugal, Ireland as well, but Greece also, where wages have been cut, but unemployment went up because of the financial crisis but also because domestic demand was being squeezed. And then on the right-hand side of the graph, you have all these countries like Germany, but also France, Netherlands, Belgium, where the crisis was being replied to with the policy of Kurzarbeit, where you kept employment despite the crisis. This whole popular mantra of saying we squeeze wages and we increase jobs or exports is not really acknowledged by the facts, as is also the result of this paper. You can quote a number of reasons why this isn't working. One reason is that an export-driven boom can work if you are a small, open economy, but if you are a large, closed economy, then the impact on domestic demand is much, much bigger and negative than the positive impact you can expect from exports. And of course, it's also a case of the fallacy of composition, as economists tend to call it. So what works for one of us, if one country can escape from the crisis by a bigger than neighbor policy, by increasing exports, well, that cannot be the case if all of us are trying to do the same thing. So you can think of many reasons why this kind of policy is not working. Let me shift to the second message of the paper, which is on the European dimension of wage policy. Where, as said, the paper describes that we need such a European approach to wage policy because things are interdependent in Europe. And well, here I have to say that the instruments to set in motion a European approach on wage policy, they exist. It's called European economic governance with the Troika, but also with country-specific recommendations the Commission is issuing each year to each and every member state. So what I would like to do now very shortly is to take a look at the Commission's country-specific recommendations of this year, particularly on the issue of wages, and to show you in what way the Commission is setting up this European dimension of wage policy. So their general line is to say wages need to evolve in line with productivity. That is what the Commission is saying in its text, but and that sounds like a pretty good line. It may sometimes even sound like a trade union demand. We want wages to increase with productivity. So they've taken over the slogan of this demand, but if you look at how they are implementing it, a number of things need to be said. And a first problem is the recommendations that are missing. Because in Europe, there are several countries, even many countries, where real wages are lagging behind productivity. And that does not reach the mindset of the Commission. In the country-specific recommendations, you will not find a single country where the Commission is saying, hold on, wages have stayed behind productivity, there's a need for wages to catch up. So here on the graph, you see the accumulated increase in real wages. These are the blue bars over the 2008-2015 period. And you also see the accumulated increase in productivity over the same period, the orange bars. And well, we can pick out one or two countries, but take the example of Poland, which is the extreme. So their productivity over that period has increased by more than 10%. And yes, real wages also increased by 10%, but it means there's a gap between real wages and productivity of 10%, and that there's a possibility for Polish wages to catch up significantly. But nothing about that is being said in the Commission's country-specific recommendations. I would also like to mention the example of the UK, where the Commission in its report, country report on the UK, which was published 2 months before the recommendations, but in its report, the Commission openly says there is a problem with low pay in the UK. You can see it here also on the slide, where you see that real wages in the UK are falling a bit over this period, whereas productivity has increased a little bit. But again, in the recommendation itself on the UK, there's no trace of this. Similar for Estonia. Estonia is being analyzed by the Commission in its country report of having a too low minimum wage, but there's no recommendation to Estonia saying, well, please consider to increase the minimum wage a little bit. And of course, concerning Germany, which has been the wage competitor of the last decade, no recommendation to say to Germany, please catch up with wages a little bit. So all in all, if you do the sum of this graph, you'll find that there are 22 member states where real wages are lagging behind productivity, 22 out of the 28, and nothing of this comes into the recommendations of the Commission. That's the first problem, and let me now shift to the second problem, which is the last problem I would like to mention. Then you have, in the Commission's recommendations, countries that are being targeted, where the Commission is saying, in those countries, real wages or wages have evolved too fast, compared to productivity, so they should squeeze wages, flexibilize their wage setting system. And then if you look at these countries, then you see that the recommendation does not line up with the facts. One example is Belgium, where Belgium is being condemned by the Commission in its country recommendation of saying, oh, you have a weak link between wages and productivity because wages have evolved too fast. Again, if you look at the facts, you will see that real wages in Belgium increased by 5 or 6% over that period, but productivity has increased by 10%. The same for Spain or other countries where Spain is being targeted by the Commission, where the Commission is saying you need to decentralize wage bargaining even further. But if you look at the numbers of Spain, you see that real wages there have been stagnant over this period, whereas productivity has increased by 20%. So the recommendations are not in line with the facts, with the reality. And of course, what is the real reason behind the Commission targeting countries like Belgium and Spain is not that in those countries real wages have evolved out of line with productivity in that particular sense. It's because the Commission is doing a relative comparison of saying, well, we need to compare the wage cost evolution in Belgium with the evolution in France and neighboring countries. And for France, they are saying we need to compare the wage cost evolution of France with what happens in Spain and other countries. So what the Commission is doing is doing these relative comparisons, these comparisons on competitive positions. But as said, these are relative things. If one country improves its cost competitiveness versus other countries, then the wage cost position of other countries deteriorates in the same sense. So it's a tricky business the Commission is doing here, because we might end up in competing against each other, in that way depressing domestic demand and each other's export markets, and also pushing our economies into lower and lower inflation. To convince you of this, here you have another slide, another graph. So the blue line are nominal wage costs evolution for the euro area as a whole over the past 15 years. The other line is the line of inflation, and you see that inflation and wage costs tend to evolve very closely with each other. So in other words, if with this competitive wage game you push wage costs everywhere down in the euro area, don't be surprised that inflation falls from 2 to 1 to 0.5% and so on. And then you get the ECB panicking and doing all kinds of tricks with money to get inflation up. But if you don't address this cause of stagnating wage costs, then you will not increase inflation either. So my conclusion here is that there's a kind of paradox here. On the one hand, there is this European dimension to wages, and we need to discuss wages also from this European point of view. But the unfortunate thing is that the European institution that should assist us in doing so is kind of doing the wrong thing. And so that creates a problem for us and a challenge for us as trade unions to convince the Commission of taking a real European point of view on this issue of wage policy. And here I think that the paper of Özlem and Thomas can be very helpful for us. Thank you for your attention.